Hi, I'm Jacques Delisle. I'm professor of law and political science and deputy director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China here at Penn. And I'm delighted to have with us today Charlene Barshevsky. Ambassador Barshevsky has worn many hats, including the one probably most familiar to those who watch the China issues, was her role as the U.S. trade representative during the Clinton administration when China entered the WTO. So we're going to be talking about some of that history and where we are now and how we get out of it, perhaps, in the bit of time we have today. So we're 40 years past the opening to China, really the normalization of relations, which brought conditional most favored nation or normal trade relations status between China and the U.S. Granting that to China. And of course, in 2000, you finished a very long and painful negotiation that led to Congress passing permanent normal trading relations, which was a condition for China getting into the WTO, or perhaps more precisely, for the U.S. meeting the obligations it would then have to China. And that was a very successful story, right? China becomes an even more major trading partner, great opportunities for U.S. exports, lots of U.S. firms getting in on the ground, services sectors starting to open up, all this sort of stuff. And now here we are, 2019, and suddenly the worm seems to have turned a bit. We're on the brink of, or some would say deeply into, a trade war where we've got $250 billion, with perhaps another amount of that, 260 billion more Chinese goods possibly subject to tariffs from the U.S. China's retaliated with 110 billion U.S. goods being subject to tariffs. We've had these trade negotiations which keep not quite reaching a result. A lot going on. So what happened? How did we get from the rosy days of 2000 to the current, really much less happy state of U.S.-China trade relations?
Well, I think, first of all, the days weren't necessarily rosy in 2000, and I'll come to that in a minute. But, of course, China's reform and opening started with Deng Xiaoping. So it really started in 1978. As you say, it's been 40 years. And starting with Deng Xiaoping, with sort of tentative steps toward reform, continuing on through the 1990s and into the first half of the 2000s, you saw China not only effecting internal economic reform on its own, but also through WTO accession, expanding and deepening that reform very significantly. Let's keep in mind that China is the world's second largest importer, and that would not have happened without a WTO entry. But what happened is, while China had been on a convergent course, or near a more convergent course with Western market economics, and therefore the WTO, what we saw around 2005, 2006 was that China's internal reform and opening began to sputter, and then it stopped. And rather than continuing on a convergent course, China began to diverge course. And under Xi Jinping, that divergent course, a statist approach, has accelerated significantly, so that China's internal economy, while robust and so on, and its external trade relationships are really no longer in sync with where its largest trading partners tend to be. Why did this happen? It's hard to know what fully the motives were, except that China turned from more market-oriented systems toward a resurgence of state-led enterprises, toward the creation of champion companies, Huawei being one but not the only one, toward heavy subsidization of favored sectors. In the mid-2000s, those were called strategic emerging industries. Now they're all routinely referred to as Made in China 2025. And for China, in China's view, this seemed to be a better course in that the state became the dominant actor. And under Xi Jinping, of course, the party is even more dominant still. So now we see the U.S. and China in conflict. China is also in conflict with its other major trading partners, with Europe, Australia, and others, because of its economic practices, principally on the technology side, but not exclusively on the technology side. And so that's one thread. Second thread in the current tensions is the U.S. financial meltdown in 2008, 2009, which continues to reverberate today. But China saw an opening to make its own path. the U.S. did relatively little to stop it at that point. Third strand in this story is, I think, a failure on the part of the U.S. to adequately enforce the commitments China made. There were many specific commitments made that applied only to China, including, for example, a prohibition on forced technology transfer. Remarkably, the U.S. has never sued China on that basis. So a somewhat lax enforcement regime, I think, also contributed. And finally, I think a too slow realization of China's U-turn. And so letting it get ahead of where policymakers then later discovered it was. And I think all of these strands have come together to create a very difficult situation between the U.S. and China, not to mention job loss in the U.S. on the manufacturing side that some economists have attributed to China.
So you've stressed the change in China and the U.S. reaction to it. Let me throw out a couple of other factors that are sometimes in the discussion and see if you think they mattered once. One argument was that there was going to be a honeymoon period, that when China first entered in 2000, it had been such a long, tough slog to get the deal done, and China really made some pretty big concessions. It didn't try to take advantage of developing country exceptions to the rules under the WTO. It didn't try to take the socialist transitional economy thing, and it agreed to things like a very short trigger for essentially surges of exports. Yep. So it took a pretty tough deal. And although many reforms had been made, as you've pointed out, and although the story that's often told, which you would know better than just about anybody, is that then Chinese Premier Zhu Rongji saw the WTO commitment as a way of forcing through reform at home. So how much of it was, okay, we're going to give you some amount of time, we're going to give you some number of years, and by the middle 2000s and a bit later, that starts to wear out, and it's worn out even more now. So do you buy that part of the story? And another one is that as China's moved up the value chain, they're starting to compete in industries that really matter to the U.S. We'd lost textiles, we'd lost a lot of low-end electronics already, but when we're getting into the IP-intensive industries, it's now kind of hitting us where we live. Sure. Do you think that's part of the story?
Absolutely. So the composition of China's trade with the U.S. has changed. As you said, in the earlier years, they were exporting low-value goods. We were exporting high-value goods. Now we're competing increasingly on sort of mid-level technologies and technological goods, but we are becoming fast competitors on higher-end technology, in part a function of theft by China and forced technology transfer requirements in China, and in part a function of China being an extremely inventive and innovative society quite on its own. So there's no question that has led to the tension. And indeed, when people talk about the trade war, I think of it as a technology war rather more than a trade war. And with respect to the honeymoon period, I think that in the beginning, China implemented its WTO commitments actually rather well. And that implementation period went better than many thought it would go. I think it was, by that time, of course, the Clinton administration was long since over, but I think the George W. Bush administration watched that pretty carefully. But then I think as things began to lapse, as promises were made and not kept by China with respect to further reform and opening, then I think you saw a bit of a lackadaisical view. Part of that was the U.S. financial crisis and an inward turning by the U.S., the importance of stabilizing the U.S. economy, and China's importance at that time as being one of the few sources of demand for a world in which there was a dearth to little demand, able to pull countries back out of what was becoming a very steep recessionary spiral. So part of it was that. Part of it was U.S. involvement in Middle East wars, further diverting its attention from China. And part of it, as I say, may have been that some of China's actions, which were clear to people on the ground, were less clear to policymakers. And there was simply a sort of a failure of a meeting of the minds sufficiently early in this process of divergence to sort of right the ship.
And one of the other developments in that period you're talking about, of course, was complaints about China being slow to open service sectors, financial services, insurance, areas where they're heavily regulated, so it's maybe a little harder to pick up exactly where we're crossing the line from legitimate regulation to protectionism. So you've mentioned the U.S. being a little slow to push back. Now, the U.S. did use WTO mechanisms. The U.S. and China have been, since China's entry, about the most frequent WTO litigants out there.
Right.
And many of them involve complaints about Chinese practices. So it's either a U.S. complaint about a Chinese practice or a Chinese complaint about the U.S. imposing an anti-dumping duty or a countervailing duty, which ultimately is about a Chinese practice. But you think we didn't do that all that much, I'm gathering. And so what could we have done more, either under the WTO general rules or under the specific provisions that China committed to in its protocol of accession, some of which, of course, are now lapsed?
Right. So I think on the issue of specific WTO cases, the U.S. was certainly right to pursue the cases it had pursued. No quarrel with that. The win-loss record is very good in favor of the United States, and all of that is positive. I think that the protocol of accession, which prohibited forced tech transfer, should have been the subject of a case. It wasn't, I suspect, because of some difficulty in gathering evidence. Companies are reluctant to come forward. They also don't want to admit technology was stolen, which is the same actually in the United States as well. Second of all, the disciplines imposed on state enterprise and state enterprise activities could have been the basis for an additional suit. And last, of course, and most important, the agreement, as you noted, prohibited surges of imports of Chinese goods into the United States if they caused market disruption in the U.S. Market disruption is a very low legal standard, and if China were found to be creating market disruption in any sector, the President of the United States would have been authorized to undertake any action he or she deemed warranted. Quotas, tariffs, prohibitions, bans, so on and so forth. That should have been done and should have been utilized. It was a provision that was utilized only once in 12 years. That was by Barack Obama. But in addition, under the general WTO agreement, there is something called nullification and impairment. It's sort of the nuclear option, but I think quite justified in this case, and that is a provision that allows a party, let's say the United States, to essentially sue another party, let's say China, on the basis that the benefits the United States thought it would get from China's WTO accession have not fully occurred. And that's because China has reverted to a kind of state-led approach to its economy, heavy discrimination against foreign companies, heavy subsidization of homegrown companies. That these practices and many others have nullified or impaired the benefits we, the United States, thought we would get. Other countries clearly would have joined that suit because many have exactly the same complaints. And what is the remedy if you were to win, which is not easy to do, but what's the remedy if you were to win? You could forego MFN, which is very nuclear. Mm-hmm. The point of the case would have been to bring China to the table in a serious way. That would have been the point of the case.
And as you point out, MFN has been there. It wasn't obligatory until the legislation in 2000, but even in the wake of Tiananmen, which is the closest we came to yanking MFN, ultimately we didn't.
And ultimately we didn't.
We did not.
Exactly.
So what do you think of the critique that says, although many of the points you make, that is Chinese behavior that is not consistent with WTO commitments or obligations, we could have done more with that. But there's a critique that says some of the things that are problematic in China's economic behavior are hard to police with WTO rules. Mm-hmm. Nobody polices intellectual property perfectly. How much is enough? Maybe you can police flat-out state subsidization, but what do you do about companies that maybe get the nudge, nudge, wink, wink that they don't have to worry about the bottom line fully, or they pursue more politicized strategies? Where's the line between that and legitimate industrial policy? There's a bunch of gray there. Is this a systematic problem where the WTO does a good job of catching trade law violations by countries that operate the way the U.S. does, but a less good job at allowing us to police that kind of behavior?
I think it's very difficult to police the kind of behavior you've said, even in the context of countries that abide by WTO rules. So there are many intellectual property cases the U.S. has brought against Canada, against Europe. Clearly, these are market economies, rule of law countries, similar to the United States. and yet you'll see cases on that. European state-owned enterprises were a big issue for the United States during the 1970s, 1980s, very difficult to police. There's no question China's system is difficult to police in what we would call these gray areas, as they are for other countries that also operate in these kinds of gray areas. To me, the best use of U.S. time would have been to begin to remake the WTO and thereby push China in the direction of either reform, sustainably, durably, or be completely disadvantaged commercially. And the way the U.S. should have done that is to stay in TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which created a very high standard agreement covering many of these areas that are in this gray zone. It should then have taken that agreement to Europe. Then you have 60% of global GDP on a system different from the WTO system. By different, I mean much more rigorous, much tougher on countries, much better dispute settlement system. Then China can choose. Does it want to have the economic opportunity to 60% of the global economy, or does it want to be disadvantaged? And at a minimum, it would have strengthened the United States and the U.S. alliance structure, quite apart from whatever China decided to do. And it would have, in effect, rewritten the rules of the WTO, because it's hard to ignore 60% of global GDP. So to my mind, this would have been a more constructive way of proceeding, a more durable way of proceeding, one that didn't hurt the U.S. economy as tariffs do, since tariffs are taxes on consumers, and one that reinforced the United States alliance structure with its closest partners. And I think that is an aspect that is not often discussed, but is one of the most critical features of what TPP would have done. It would have cemented the U.S. position in Asia, which China does not want to see, would have strengthened our allies in Asia, which China would rather not see, and would have led to better balance in Asia, no one picking sides, but a balance of power in Asia, which will slowly erode over time without agreements of this sort for the United States.
So you're telling a compelling story about some constant themes that run through the nearly 20 years and really back before that when we first started talking, really at the dawn of the WTO, about China's possible accession. But the sort of political atmospherics of this have been a little more ragged in a sense. We started with what were perhaps inflated expectations, and there were reasons to do this in domestic politics, but to say that engaging China in the WTO would lead to all sorts of great changes in China, and those haven't fully panned out for reasons you've talked about, and maybe they were a little exaggerated because of the need to sell Congress, or a little optimistic perhaps. Then we went through the phase with the TPP when Obama said, again, perhaps not the best external politics, but understandable internal politics, that the TPP was part of a contest between the U.S. and China about who would write the rules of the international economy for the 21st century. And now we're in a rather different moment. And some of the things you have said are China's problems with China in the relationship with the U.S. and the broader engagement with the international order. Some of your list is a bit like the list one would hear from the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. Coerced intellectual property transfer, outright intellectual property theft, problems with market access, problems with selective application, be it anti-monopoly law or regulation. These are things you've spoken about in our conversation and in other contexts. That's a pretty familiar list. But I'm guessing that somehow if I were to have Robert Lighthizer rather than Charlene Barshefsky in that chair, we might get a slightly different discussion about how one should pursue dealing with those problems. So what's the Trump administration doing wrong, and what are they doing right, in your opinion?
Well, the list of problems with China has been well known, and they were the subject of much of the engagement and WTO enforcement actions taken during the 8 years of the Obama administration. There's nothing new in the list. A little more evidence here, a little less evidence there, so on and so forth, but the list has been well known. The process of engagement that had been undertaken, I think, by Obama, which combined negotiation with China with TPP, that is to say, negotiation with China's other trading partners for a different arrangement, coupled with WTO enforcement actions, I always thought was basically about right in terms of composition, but not right in terms of moxie and in terms of real push against China. And these dialogues that were held during the Obama years became more a way for China to manage the United States than the U.S. managing China. So this, I think, helped spawn the kind of Trump administration approach, which is take a 2x4, whack the head with a 2x4, and if the patient hasn't died, see what you can extract. And the real question there is, how durable is that? Whatever will be announced, we already know, will be the best, the biggest, President has used the word himself, the most epic trade agreement ever done. Here it's been 20 years post-WTO, and we've come to this point. Where will we be in 20 years following the 2x4 approach? The internal reforms that are asked of China are reforms long known to China and the international community if it wants to propel itself forward. So these are reforms outlined in many reports, including in the China 2030 strategy done by the World Bank many years ago. Those reforms, if they had been installed over these many years, would have made China stronger, would have made its economy rather more stable than it is today, and would have ameliorated some of the problems we see in China's financial sector in particular, and therefore would have put China on a firmer footing than it is now. So these reforms have to be undertaken by China if it's going to propel itself forward on the basis of real data, not made-up numbers, and if it wants to escape the middle-income trap, so on and so forth. So we'll have to see. I think whatever comes out of the administration, we already know how it will be announced, and it will take a number of years before we see what the outcome will be. In the interim, to my mind, the single most important thing the U.S. can do is get its own house in order. It doesn't matter what China does, how fast or how slow it goes, if our infrastructure is crumbling, if we don't provide R&D funding to our major research institutions, if we don't have budgetary capacity to do the things in the United States we need to be doing. And the list is well known on education and other fronts. It is the strengthening of the United States that is the single most important thing we can do. If we're on an economically stronger footing, if we're better educated, if we're funding R&D the way we used to fund R&D, we're still riding on the coattails of R&D funding from the 1950s. If we funded it the way we did then, if we strengthened our alliance structure as we did then, which is the way the U.S. projects power, we would be in a far better position to address China. In other words, we can't control what China does at the end of the day. It's a fifth of the world's population, the world's second biggest economy, and soon the world's biggest economy on a purchase power parity basis, just about, coming very close to the U.S. now on that basis. But we can completely control what we do within the United States. And that has to be a principal part of any program with respect to China.
And there, of course, China is throwing immense resources at some of these undertakings, R&D of its own, requiring R&D shops to be opened up by foreign investors and all that. There's some question about how efficient it is, but it's certainly a large number. So I certainly take the point that on both sides, strength begins at home with the domestic economy and all that makes possible militarily and otherwise. But we still do have a bilateral relationship, which I think most people accurately describe as the world's most important bilateral relationship. And the broader atmospherics beyond the trade and investment disputes you've been talking about are not so good right now. It wasn't too long ago that there seemed to be a pro-engagement consensus in the U.S., and now it has turned almost 180 degrees, at least in policy-relevant circles. And I'm wondering what you see as the things that have contributed to that and whether we can manage our way out of it. I mean, some things have changed since the negotiations you were doing back in the run-up to 2000. The business community in the U.S. was then very supportive of China getting into the WTO. Now it's a much less happy group with its experiences on the ground in China. And the Republican Party, which has often been relatively free trade, at least part of the time, is now very much in line with taking a tougher line toward China. And we have a national security set of issues in the mix. This has come up with Huawei, it's come up with ZTE. So that's a pretty long list of things that make the relationship a lot tougher. Do you think those are intractable? Can they be managed? How should they weigh into our considerations? Because, as you know, one of the big critiques of the Trump administration has been a tendency to mix national security concerns with trade concerns.
Right. So that's a big question.
Well, we're almost out of time, so I thought I'd throw it all at you at once.
Right, exactly. But I would say this. There has to be a way to manage the relationship or it's war, which is unthinkable on almost every basis one could consider. So we have to say, well, first of all, let's set aside ideology. They have a particular political system, we won't change that. We have a particular political system, they won't change that. And put that aside a moment. We have some common concerns. Whether it is or was climate change, or whether it is global pandemics, whatever it might be, global terrorism, there are some common concerns. China contributes less than as advertised, and that has been advertised by the United States. But even with that, you obviously want to cooperate if it's in your interest to cooperate. It won't always be in your interest to cooperate, that's for sure. But where it is, you can't put yourself in an adversarial position such that you can never cooperate because, again, then the only thing you have left is something that is potentially exceedingly dangerous with no stop to it. Then with respect to those issues that are the difficult issues, I think the United States has to continue to not only work toward moving China in the right direction, working with its allies, working through other agreements that leave China out, putting greater economic pressure on China, and taking countermeasures if we need to. In other words, if China persists in the direction it's going in, I think the United States will simply have to take its own measures, as Trump has done, but Trump has done it without having tested the proposition whether he had to do it this way. And my own view is he never had to do it this way, and it will affect the durability of whatever is agreed to. But last, I would say, the engagement strategy never died. What are negotiations if not engagement? During the Obama years, these meetings were negotiations. They weren't pointed enough. They weren't narrow enough. They weren't focused enough. There were too many things on the table that got lost. But engagement is negotiation. That's what's happening now. Engagement are the calls between Bush and Xi Jinping, between Trump and Xi Jinping. These used to be conversations between Xi Jinping and Obama, and before Xi Jinping between Hu Jintao and Obama. So these elements of engagement persist and will have to persist because we have to manage this relationship in such a way that the pieces can fit okay together. Not great, but okay. But in the meantime, the United States has to strengthen itself. I can't emphasize enough the importance. It is so fundamental. It's fundamental to our future. And the way in which we can continue to play the leadership role we've played, which is very important because it does matter who writes the rules. And it does matter who's in the position to enforce the rules. The U.S., by dint of its economic size and the attractiveness of our market, was almost always in a position to enforce the rules through formal and informal means. We have to remain in a position to do that. We won't be the only country who can do it any longer, but we have to remain in a position where we can still do that.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your expertise, your long experience in this field, and I think it's an extremely useful reminder of all the subtle work that's done through policymakers and through diplomats that all too often gets drowned out by the rhetoric and the swings over broad policies, whether they be decoupling or as you say, taking the 2x4. And I just hope that message gets through to everyone out there who's listening to this and hopefully has some role in getting us through the current difficult period. Thank you so much, Ambassador Barshevsky.
My pleasure. Thank you.
For more insight from Knowledge at Wharton, please visit knowledge.wharton.upenn.edu.